Welcome to the Practical Futurist podcast, a bi-weekly show all about the near-term future with practical advice from a range of global experts to help you stay ahead of the curve. Every episode answers the question, what's the future of? With voices and opinions that need to be heard. Your host is international keynote speaker and practical futurist, Andrew Grill.
Welcome to Series 2, Episode 8 of the Practical Futurist podcast. Today's guest, all the way from Brisbane, Australia, is James Cridland, the editor of the leading source of podcast news, Podnews.net. With over 28 years in the radio and online business, in 2005, James helped launch the first daily podcast from a UK radio station and the world's first radio station streaming app. He offers a truly international view as a Brit living in Australia, working for companies across the world, including North America. He's also a keynote speaker and consultant and wrote his first podcast RSS feed in January 2005 and also launched the first live radio streaming app for mobile phones in the same year. Importantly, he's worked in the audio industry since 1989. Welcome, James.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we only spoke last week as you're a guest on the Podcast Festival, a joint production with my podcasting buddies Minter Dahl and Sam Sethi. That was a live show with viewer questions thrown in and a producer in my ear. This week is a pre-record, so we'll move it at a bit slower pace if that's okay.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. I'm glad you said that.
Look, I feel like we're on an exchange program. You're a Brit in Australia. I'm an Aussie in London. What's it like in Australia at the moment? I hear a lot of the lockdown restrictions are lifting.
Yeah, so they're beginning to lift. I mean, we can't, so I'm in Queensland. We can't go anywhere in Queensland. We're not allowed to leave our great state, although our state, frankly, is big enough. So that's all okay. But yeah, things are beginning to relax. I'm not quite sure what the latest figures were, but certainly we've had, one coronavirus case in the last week or so here in Queensland. So we're doing pretty well, rather better than you guys, I think.
And your site, podnews.net, which I encourage everyone to sign up for the daily newsletter, have you seen an increase in traffic? Is podcasting, thriving during this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly been an increase in the amount of people getting it, which is nice, and the amount of people, using it. But I mean, obviously, there's been an increase in podcasting as well. So actually, in May, we saw a new record for the amount of podcasts launched, 96,500. So, you can clearly see, and yes, some of that is going to be due to coronavirus and the fact that you can launch a podcast if you're at home and you might be a bit, bored or whatever. But I think also part of that is just because podcasting is actually growing and quite a lot of those were going to launch anyway. So, a tremendous amount of growth there. And certainly the podcast hosts that I'm talking to, they're saying that there's a significant increase in the amount of, in the amount of people signing up and the amount of support calls that they're having and everything else, which is all bodes good, I think, for where we're going.
Now, you are the podcasting stat guru, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But what number of these podcasts will sort of survive? I mean, lots are starting up because people in their bedrooms. When they go back to work and things lift, do you think there'll be some longevity? What's the sort of half-life of a podcast series?
Yeah, I think that's going to be interesting, isn't it? I mean, quite a lot of podcasts don't last particularly long, it has to be said. That may be by design. It may be because people, realize that actually producing great audio is quite difficult. And so therefore they can't necessarily work too hard on that. I mean, if you have a look at the amount of active podcasts, there are 1.1 million podcasts in Apple Podcasts. And about half of those are active. So that means that they've published one episode in the past 90 days. So about half of them are active, about half of them are inactive. And that's, I think, actually pretty good in terms of, the longevity of podcasting, the fact that, 500,000 are still being currently made, that's quite a thing, I think.
I was often asked, is podcasting the new blogging? And you've been around probably as long as I have online. Do you think that people are now saying, well, it's not simple to do a great audio show, but you can actually set something up and get your news and thoughts out there? But is podcasting the new blogging?
I don't think so. I mean, it's interesting. I was talking to Turkish television last night, and and they were saying, is podcasting growing? And I think one of the interesting things around podcasting, it's been going for 15 years, but it's been a slow and steady growth every single year. So every single year it's been getting bigger. But what podcasting hasn't been is it hasn't been, a MySpace or a Bebo or a Vine. It hasn't, dramatically, increased and then all of a sudden disappeared again. And blogging arguably was a bit like that. There was a tremendous couple of years where everybody had a blog and then realized that very few people were actually reading them. And so therefore the amount of blogs in the world have gone down. And obviously Facebook has come around as well. And I think, podcasting is different in that it has just been slowly and steadily growing. And that's probably good news, I think.
So your own service, podnews.net, what was the idea behind it? And why do you think there was a gap in the market for what you offer?
Yeah, so I mean, I was in a pub in Los Angeles, and I was at one of these worldwide radio conferences. It's one of those American things where they invite two foreign people and they call it worldwide. So I was there chatting with an American friend, and he was saying, where do you go to find news about podcasting? And I suddenly thought, I've been running a Radio Trends newsletter for many years now, and I suddenly thought, well, that's a good question, because there was, at the time, there was one weekly newsletter, and that weekly newsletter, it's a great newsletter. It's still going now, but it really very much focuses on the US. It focuses on public radio. It focuses on, a very small part of what podcasting is. And I thought to myself, as a Brit, as one that's moved to Australia, as one that's worked in Canada, worked in the US, it's probably that, there's probably an opportunity there for something which is a quick, overview of what's going on in the podcasting landscape, but one which looks at the podcasting landscape from a much broader view than just having a look at what's coming out of New York and Washington. I think being able to also look at what's coming out of the Middle East and India and the Chinese podcast industry and all of that is fascinating as well, because that can actually help us understand what we should be doing more. So that was basically the idea. And at the end of May 2017, I started doing it and really played around with the workflow, working out how I could produce a product, what that product would be, what people actually click on, how I could produce it. And and I've been doing it every single day, partially by mistake, but every single day since then, really. So, it's been going okay, I think.
Well, I was going to ask you about the workflow, because for those that haven't signed up yet, you get amazing news stories. I'd love to know where you get the stories from in the first place. And accompanying that is a spoken word, if you like, headline. It's a 2 or 3 minute shot, I suppose, and that comes back to your radio background. So you can get it both ways. And often I get the podcast feed, so I may not always listen to the audio, but I look at the show notes and I go back to the website. But how do you organise your workflow to do a daily newsletter and a daily record and publish?
I suppose one of the things that I'm very lucky at being able to do is that I do the tech as well. So I've written the code that produces the website, as well as, being the journalist that goes and gets the news stories. And the reason why that's important is that literally everything, the way that the website works, the way that I put the information in, is all designed to save me as much time as possible, because I still have other jobs. I'm still a radio consultant. I still go, I fly around the world talking at radio conferences. Not that much at the moment, it has to be said, but still. And so therefore I needed to make sure that it was something that I could continue doing, even if I was busy doing other things as well. So one example of that is there's a bit in the newsletter which is all about new podcasts, and there's a little image there, and there's a link to that podcast and a bit more information about it. The image, as one example, appears automatically because my code has worked out, I'm talking about a podcast, I know where to get this particular image, blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of that sort of careful, automation in there just to make it easier and quicker to produce something. But having said that, I'm doing an awful lot of reading. I'm quite active in many of the podcasting communities across the internet, places like Reddit and at Facebook and stuff like that. And of course, I know how RSS feeds work, which is always handy. My RSS reader is my friend, and I get an awful lot of information out of that. So that's a really useful tool as well. And it's interesting how many places still have RSS feeds, which are there, which are available, which really helps keep me up to date with a bunch of interesting news that otherwise pass other people by.
We talked about this last week on the Podcasting Festival, the whole RSS. RSS, for those listening, stands for really simple syndication. And years ago, it was just used as that XML markup to get blog posts out there. And it's been the cornerstone of podcasting. But we did talk last week, and we might talk here a bit more about whether it needs to change, what's available now and in a standard that's probably, 15 years old, maybe older, and what does it need to evolve to allow monetization, show notes, all those sort of things. And Apple seemed to be leading the charge and sort of forcing the standardization. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that is. I mean, so, RSS as a thing, and I love how it's called really simple syndication and it's anything but. But as a thing, it was thought up by a chap from Microsoft and a man called Dave Weiner. Really built to move data from one place to another. And then Adam Curry, who was an MTV DJ at the time, if you remember back when MTV actually played music, he ended up thinking, wouldn't it be a clever idea if you could also link to files through this? He was thinking about it from pirating TV shows, but actually it turned out that it was a really handy way of doing podcasts as well, doing pieces of audio, so that sort of started going. Steve Jobs or somebody at Apple thought, well, this is interesting because this is a way of keeping people using the iPod, keeping people picking up that device every single day if they can get lots of content on there, lots of free content on there that we, Apple, don't have to pay for. Why don't we put podcasts into iTunes so that it will automatically stick new content onto the iPod? And that's basically why Apple jumped in and why Apple wanted to make it look a little bit nicer, work a little bit better. And so quite a lot of the ideas behind a podcast, the fact that you have a category, the fact that you have an image, the fact that that image is square and should be anywhere between 3,000 to 1,400 pixels wide. All of that stuff was basically Apple wanting to make podcasting look a little bit nicer on their devices. And Apple has really been driving those sorts of standards ever since. So making sure that the categories are correct, making sure that, you can now mark things as a serial podcast or as an episodic podcast, and all of that sort of thing is all basically Apple's ideas. So that's been really helpful. But also that means, conversely, that if you want to come up with a new idea around podcasting, if you want to add a donate button, for example, then you've got to convince somebody at Apple because Apple has 65% of the market. So it's good news in that we've had a strong leader. It's also potentially bad news because actually, a benevolent dictator is, I believe, the phrase that some people use. They've been really good for us, but they've also, basically told the podcasting world what we should be doing. And it would be, I think, useful if there was a couple of challenges to Apple. And currently, not really seeing too much of that, but Spotify is beginning to grow, which is certainly helpful.
You mentioned the S word, which was helpful segue. Not much competition from anyone else. That's a fairly bold statement. I thought some of your stats said that Spotify sometimes had overtaken Apple. What's the latest with Spotify, and can they be a real challenger for Apple?
Well, so the latest with Spotify, and actually the latest as we speak, I'm busy putting together Podnews for what I call tonight, what you will call this morning. And one of the things that Podnews is reporting on is that in Canada, when you look at younger audiences, then Spotify is in the lead in terms of podcast use. So Apple, and you would kind of, this sounds a bit like common sense. The older folk who have more money are using the more expensive hardware, which is Apple hardware, and therefore Apple Podcasts, and so therefore, students and young folk who are spending their money on other things are probably using cheaper Android phones and using Spotify. But if you look at it from the whole world, you can see that depending on who you talk to, either Spotify has about a 10% market share, or depending on who else is working those numbers out, Spotify is partially in the lead in some countries, but not in others. And certainly in the US, Apple remains the market leader. I think, again, you can have a look at podcast consumption in many different ways. You can have a look at per download, you can have a look at per user. And my suspicion is, having looked through my stats, because I host my own podcast as well, my suspicion is that if you have a look at it per download, then Apple is still very much in the lead. But if you have a look at it per user, per unique user, then actually Spotify is quite high in there. So Spotify users listen to less podcasts, but perhaps there are more of them. Interesting times, I think. But having said that, Spotify is still quite small. Google should be the third largest podcast app. Maybe it is by now, but it's only about 2% of all downloads. It's still doing, very, very small numbers. My suspicion is that it's going to grow quite fast. They've now got an Apple app as well as an Android app. Google Podcasts is appearing in all kinds of searches as well. So my suspicion is that it should do pretty well. But what we really need, ideally, for the industry is we need Apple and Spotify and Google to all have about 25% market share, and everybody else crowding around for the remainder. And I think that would probably be good news for all of us, I think.
Now, if you look at why Spotify added podcasts, similar to what Apple did around the standards, they wanted things to work their way. And if you've already got a subscription to Spotify, this is another reason to keep using the app. You wrote a really interesting article on Medium a few weeks ago about Joe Rogan's move to Spotify. And there you mused that, does this threaten an open ecosystem for podcasting, because Spotify essentially are buying an audience? But you also said, do we actually have an open ecosystem to defend? This whole buying podcast shows, is this an inflection point for podcasting? And do you think we'll see more of these platform deals?
Oh, I think it's very interesting. And I think certainly if you take Joe Rogan, which is the biggest podcast in the world by any of the data that I've seen, Joe himself talks about 190 million downloads per month. I'm not quite sure what that figure really is, but nevertheless, if you look, again, let's have a look in Canada. 1 out of 5 of every podcast listener in Canada has listened to the Joe Rogan Experience at least once. which is a massive number. So if you were to take all of Canada and put every single person who's listened to the Joe Rogan Experience into a city, you would get a city as big as Vancouver. It's a tremendously popular thing. So if a lot of people follow Joe Rogan over from their current podcast app into Spotify, then Spotify will be, very, very pleased. They can serve ads against those people. They can hopefully sign them up for a subscription, because I think it's worthwhile pointing out Joe Rogan will still be free, but you will need to sign up for an account. But it's still free to have a listen on Spotify. You'll just get ads on there instead. So I think from that point of view, that's going to be really interesting. It's going to be interesting seeing how many people stick with him. If you've been watching him on YouTube, you won't be able to anymore. If you've been listening on the Apple Podcast app, you won't be able to anymore. And so how many people will stop listening to that podcast, and what will that mean to the to that particular show? I don't know. But it's certainly interesting times, and it's certainly not the first as well. Spotify has jumped in and used a bunch of these tools in the past to grab as many interesting podcasts as they possibly could. So all of Parcast's stuff, a lot from Gimlet, is now produced exclusively for Spotify. Last Podcast on the Left is, I believe, another one, and so on and so forth. So my suspicion is that we'll see rather a lot more than that. I don't know whether Apple will follow. My thoughts around Apple is that actually, if Apple were being clever, they would start being friends to podcasters by allowing podcasters to sell podcasts through the Apple Store, which would be really interesting, because if the only place where I could buy this particular podcast that I really liked was through Apple Podcasts, then that would be, just as powerful, if not possibly more powerful, than Spotify's current, activity. So, we'll wait to see what happens there, I guess.
It's a really good idea, and if anyone from Apple's listening, hopefully they'll look at that. Now, you and I have been around the mobile space probably around the same time when operators decided to have their walled gardens. Isn't what Spotify are doing, and if Apple follows them, a similar thing? It's just another walled garden, and we can only get podcasts we like from platforms, and you then don't have that open ecosystem, and it just all gets a bit messy.
Yes, I mean, that's what the definition of an open, of a walled garden is, and therefore that's why people are concerned about there being an open podcast ecosystem. Typically, if you look at most apps, you can type in an RSS address and it will subscribe you to that podcast. So as one example, Alex Jones, the conspiracy theorist, is not available on Apple Podcasts because he talks nonsense. And so they took him off. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't listen through Apple Podcasts. You just have to know what the RSS feed is for his podcast. And then you can get his podcast on Apple Podcasts, on Overcast, on a number of these different services. Having said that, no one does that. The way that most people will listen to a podcast is they will search for it in the directory on their podcast app, and then they will hit a subscribe button. And the directory for virtually everyone, with the exception of Spotify and Stitcher and a few others, the directory from virtually everybody is controlled by Apple, is run by Apple, because Apple very cleverly worked out that they should have an API, and their API would allow anyone to go and grab information about podcasts and stick it into their own podcast app. The API is really there to help them sell music in the iTunes Music Store. But nevertheless, it's certainly there for podcast information. And so actually, Apple is running a surprising amount of the podcast directories out there. So even if you're using Pocket Casts because you don't like Apple very much, that directory almost entirely is coming directly from Apple. And once Alex Jones gets pulled out, Alex Jones is probably pulled out of all of those as well. So I think that's what the concern is around the, in inverted commas, open ecosystem. But I don't think actually that most people use, RSS feeds by typing them in, directly into a podcast app. I don't think that's really the way that most people will actually, find a new show or certainly tune into one.
So discoverability becomes the real issue, and you're right with Apple. And I think part of it is because they have humans that verify the podcast feed. You would know when you put your first episode up, a human at Apple listens to it to make sure we're not being silly and rude, and it gets verified. And I think others just don't do that. But that means there are now a proliferation of these directories, and in a way, Podnews is a directory of sorts. Podchaser, we had Bradley Davis on the podcast festival last week. They run an aggregation service. Who's going to win out of these, and how do you monetize those sort of platforms?
Well, that's a great question. So, I mean, there's a podcast directory called Listen Notes, which the bloke that runs it is selling access to that if you're a developer and you want to do fun things with it. Which is neat. Blueberry has had one of those for some time now. So yeah, I mean, is there a business in running an alternative podcast directory? I don't know. If Apple's giving one away for free, and Apple theoretically at least is doing a bit of editorial curation. I'm not entirely convinced that anybody from Apple actually has a listen, by the way. I think it's rather more a piece of technical checking rather than human beings having a listen. But nevertheless, if Apple's going to give all of that away for free, then that's how you make a monopoly, isn't it? So nobody else is really going to be able to get in there. And even if you have a look at Podchaser, Podchaser takes a lot of its initial information from the Apple directory. Because again, it's a way of finding new shows and new stuff which is available. So I think we have to be careful there. What the reason why Podnews has a list of a bunch of podcasts is purely because I wanted to be able to link in a neutral way to where to listen to a podcast. That was basically the starting point there. I use an Android phone. I don't use an Apple phone to have a listen. And so therefore a link to Apple Podcasts is entirely useless to me. So I thought to myself, right, we will make something that automatically goes off and finds links on Apple, on Google, and on Spotify. And at the very least, that's going to be a helpful place to link people to. And that tool has sort of slowly grown so that you can actually see how things work and check your the information on your podcast and the information on other people's as well.
I find that an incredibly useful function of your site. In fact, when I was starting to produce this podcast last year, I discovered all these other places where it should be listed because you thankfully have all the icons for different sites, and it just amazed me the number of different apps and platforms there are where your podcast would go. Just a final point on the discoverability. So you actually reported this week that IMDB is starting to list podcasts, and in fact, Podchaser claim they want to be the IMDB of podcasting. And I think what Podchaser is trying to do is, yes, they take the feed from Apple, but where I like what they're doing is they allow you to give credit to guests. So when this show is published, James Cridland will have been a guest on my show. You can then see where else he's been, and that goes, oh, I actually like what he had to say. Where else has he been? And I think they're probably the only site that I've seen that's doing that really well. But I think discoverability isn't just about shows; it's about genres. It's about people you like listening to. But is IMDb themselves a threat to the Podchasers of this world? Do you think?
I mean, in its current incarnation, absolutely not. I mean, apart from anything else, IMDb isn't even asking you what your RSS feed is. So from that point of view, that's not necessarily going to work. But IMDb is owned by Amazon, and Amazon, by all accounts, are really interested in getting into the podcast space as well. They have a lot of audio consumption devices called Alexa speakers, and clearly they would like to have their access on those speakers to podcasts as well as live radio. So one would assume that they are spending a fair amount of time in actually bringing their own podcast directory, to actually appear, because that would kind of make sense, wouldn't it? And certainly, the conversations I'm having with quite a few people seems to show that that Amazon are making some, real inroads into this. So that should be interesting. Is IMDB, because it's owned by Amazon, a thing that is helping Amazon produce a directory? I certainly hope not, having sat down and tried the perplexing, way of actually getting a podcast into their service at the moment. I'm now listed as a TV series for some reason. I've got no idea why, but still. So, it should be really interesting. And again, Podchaser is interesting in that they are keeping a proprietary list of all of the guests and hosts and creator credits for podcasts. Great for Podchaser, because that's obviously a piece of data that they should be holding. So's Apple as well. So if you go on some of the bigger shows, some of the more fancy shows, again, you'll actually see an image at the bottom of Joe Rogan and of Elon Musk, and you can click on Elon Musk and find out what else he's actually done. So Apple are doing that, but they're not sharing any of that data with anybody else. I say they're doing it for the big shows. They're doing it for the big shows and for mine, which is hilarious. So I'm not quite sure what I've done there, but anyway. So if you go to the bottom of a Podnews podcast, then you'll see a little grinning picture of me that probably links nowhere, but still, there we are.
Measurement and monetization. So where do you see the importance of measurement? There are platforms like Podtrac and Chartable, which I use. And how important is third-party verification like IAB for, advertisers wanting to see whether this particular podcast is worth sponsoring?
Yeah, I think when we were back working on the internet in the late 1990s, then people were talking about hits, and they were saying how many hits their website had. And a hit is just a server log line. So if your home page had 10 images on it, then every time somebody visited your website, that was 11 hits. So a hit was a completely pointless number, but nevertheless, it was large and people claimed it. And I think that's where, up until recently, podcasting was, in that we were giving out download figures, but actually what we were talking about downloads wasn't necessarily the right thing. We were talking about, the way that some podcast apps, for example, would download an hour-long podcast would be to download chunks of it that would last for about 20 seconds each. So 20 seconds, every 20 seconds for an hour, well, that's quite a lot. And if you're going to count those as separate downloads, then you're talking about 300-400 downloads instead of one, which would have been the correct answer. So making sure that if somebody is talking about a download, if somebody is talking about a listener or a unique device, making sure that that everybody is talking about the same thing is a really important is a really important plan. And that's really where the IAB came on board. So the IAB is the Internet Advertising Bureau. And this was the US Internet Advertising Bureau. By the way, I don't think the UK one has actually signed on to this yet, although the Australian IAB has. But the IAB has a standard now of what they call a download and a standard of what they call a unique device. And there are a few podcast hosts, around 9 or 10 of them, who are now certified through the IAB. So if you switch from Libsyn to Chartable, for example, then the download numbers that you see in the dashboard should be the same, because they should be worked out in the same way, and they'll be roughly similar. And I think that's hugely important. There are additionally other services like Podtrac and Chartable, and Triton run one as well, which is more of a sort of a ranker. So it shows you how you're doing in comparison to other people, and that's very helpful. What Chartable and Pod sites are also doing is they're doing attribution. So the idea there is I listen to a podcast that has an ad in it for Nike shoes, for example, and then I go to the Nike website and I buy a pair of these fancy shoes. The systems should theoretically be able to work out that I'd heard the ad and I came to the website and bought those shoes and attribute that purchase back to the podcaster where the Nike ad was on. And so that's very fancy and very clever and a bit scary. But certainly that's what some advertisers want. I think other advertisers are potentially a little bit more enlightened and don't necessarily want that kind of information because it's not actually that helpful. But nevertheless, all of that sort of attribution stuff is beginning to be, really interesting. But, the very first step of being able to say, this is a download, and I am having 2,000 of those per episode. That's a very helpful start. And so the IAB, with their work on certification, on verifying people's numbers, is actually a really helpful thing.
So in terms of monetization, I mean, you've worked in radio, so you know that it's very hard with an audio medium to advertise. Either you say at the top of the show, this show is brought to you by, or you annoyingly have in the middle a break and a non-contextual ad pops up. Is this sustainable, and where do you see monetization beyond straight advertising?
I mean, I think you can do an awful lot with audio advertising, and what I like about what you can do with podcasting, particularly if you're listening to podcasting on a streaming platform, which is Spotify, or it could be Google Podcasts, or indeed actually quite a lot of Apple as well, is that you can begin to do clever targeted advertising based on roughly where you are, what the weather's like, what device you have, et cetera, et cetera. So you can actually have an ad for Starbucks that actually talks about would you like to come in from the rain and warm up with a beautiful, coffee from such and such, if it's a cold, wet, horrible day, or if it's a lovely, warm, sunny day, then the ad might be for an iced coffee or something. So you can begin to do some quite clever stuff like that, which doesn't really get into any problems from a privacy point of view, because all it's really using is a vague location of where you are in terms of a city and the device that you're using. So you can begin to do some quite crafty things with that. I think what most podcasters are understanding is that there are lots of different ways of monetizing your show. And one way of monetizing your show, yes, might be slapping a 30-second ad about double glazing at the front of it. A different way of monetizing your show is for the podcast host to actually be talking about a specific product, because typically that seems to work rather better, and certainly in my old radio world has worked rather better there as well. But you can also then see that other people are getting involved in podcasting purely because it's a great way to make them really obvious that they are stars, that they understand what they're talking about, that they are particular subject matter experts. So actually that is probably enough for quite a few people. Other people are talking about doing live gigs and stuff like that. So when the theatres reopen, then you'll notice there are quite a few podcasts now doing on the road tours, which is really cool. So, lots of different ways. And I think if we're not careful, we look at an annoying 30-second ad of somebody shouting at you about double glazing as being the only way that you can make money out of shows, and I don't necessarily think that that's the case. I think there's so many other ways, and that's good news, I think, for all of us who are in this industry.
Yeah, dynamic insertion is probably the way to go. Before we close, I wanted to just cover the issue of B2B and B2B podcasting. I've worked in the B2B space for quite some time. So corporate podcasting, where do you see it heading, and are there companies that are doing it well?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. There are two definitions of corporate podcasts. So one of them is a podcast that a company is doing to be consumed by the public as well. So Trader Joe's being the obvious example there. American Airlines runs a podcast which it's really aimed at their employees, but it's open to anybody. So if you're a fan of American Airlines, if such a thing exists, which I seriously doubt, having flown on them once, then you can go and have a listen to that particular show. And, and that's a really smart move. So there are quite a few of those going on. I think, the interesting part is now having private corporate podcasts. So shows which are specifically for employees. If you are a large disparate workforce, actually being able to hear from the bosses in their head office 200 miles away or 2,000 miles away is probably a useful thing. And we're certainly seeing more of those going on, and more launches from podcast companies around the technology to actually help that. It's another great way. I think as we move into a world where we're hopefully less likely to be doing the daily commute into work, we're hopefully less likely to be spending money in these ridiculously over-equipped offices in the center of town that everybody has to get to, and then everybody has to get back again at the end of the day. If we can get rid of all of that stuff and do far more home working, far more remote working, then having good ways of communicating to your employees is probably an important thing. And podcasting is clearly part of that, as well, of course, as 4 million emails.
So the $64 million question, what is the future of podcasting?
Well, I think more slow and steady growth is, the main future, which I think is a good future and a good place for us to be. My hope is that we see a bit more of a mix of large names in this space. So good luck, Google. Good luck, Amazon, if you're really getting into it. And good luck, I guess, Spotify. So my hope is that we end up seeing that. But, one of the things that we do know is that human beings crave other voices, other human beings to connect with. And that's what podcasting offers. It offers that shared experience with a human connection. The podcasting and radio as a wider whole offers so well and offers so much better than Facebook or Twitter or anything else, because you can actually hear what the person sounds like. So the future, I think, for podcasting is tremendously bright.
Okay, quick fire round. One sentence answer, please. Favorite podcast?
The Bugle, which is a satirical news show from the UK, but has other people in it as well. It's very good.
The app you use to listen to podcasts?
Is Google Podcasts.
Apple or Spotify?
Google Podcasts.
Favorite length of podcast in minutes?
What's your favorite film and how long is it?
Okay, let's just expand this for a moment. So if you're going on a walk, the podcast length is probably 30 to 40 minutes. You're in a car, it differs. You're having a shower, whatever. Okay, you clearly don't have a preference. But people keep asking this, and I suppose advertisers are, well, what's the right length? How long are the shows that we sponsor? I mean, we've been recording for 43 minutes. Will people listen to all of this?
There is a radio consultant called Valerie Geller who answers this brilliantly, and she says there is no such thing as too long, only too boring. Which I think is a great answer. My answer is actually a podcast should be as long as it needs to be, but not a second longer. So if you're making a podcast, make sure that every single minute matters, because that's massively important. If you've got fluff, if you've got, if you've got crappy answers or crappy questions, and then edit them out. That's the beauty of podcasting is that it's not live, so you can actually post-produce and make something sound as brilliant as it can do.
Final quick-fire question. What's the last podcast you listened to?
The last podcast that I listened to, well, it was The Bugle, but the last podcast I listened to before that was a podcast called The Freenoter, And the Freenoter it's a podcast aimed at people who are keynote speakers. And I think that very eloquently shows off the real benefit of podcasting in that you can have a really niche audience of people who do keynote speaking at conferences, and you can still make a great podcast for those people as well.
I must look that up as a keynote speaker. I'll put the link in the show notes. Now, as this is the Practical Futurist podcast, what are 3 things that our listeners can be doing this week to either get into podcasting or enhance their own podcasting experience?
3 things. Well, I think number 1 would be obviously to subscribe to Podnews. It's free. It's at podnews.net. Yeah, well, you kind of have to. So that would obviously be one of them. I mean, I think I am always very surprised by how many people get into podcasting or start thinking about getting into podcasting without listening to many of them. So please listen to as many as you possibly can, because you'll very quickly learn what works and what doesn't. And that's a tremendous, step. Copy the bits that work from the podcasts that you love. Don't copy the bits that don't work. And you're pretty well onto a winner there. And I also think learning how to edit is a really helpful thing. Learning how to edit audio is a really helpful thing. You may be jumping to use Audacity because it's a free piece of software and it's available for download. It is probably the worst tool that you can possibly use to edit podcasts. It's an audio editor where if you make a mistake, you're stuck with it because, you can't grab a little bit from a particular interview that you got rid of earlier and blah, blah, blah. You should be using basically anything else. But if you're going to take it seriously, use an audio editor called Hindenburg, which has a free trial. And that is a much simpler, much more straightforward, but much better way of editing a good long chunk of speech.
Great tip. So I actually use Adobe Audition only because I've been using Premiere Pro for years for video and it's got a similar look and feel. But again, I pay for that product because it just works and it's really easy to move things around.
And I think, my answer would be, Audition is great. Audition is an expensive piece of software, but if it works for you, it works. Audition is a music editor, and that means that it's very good at doing podcasts, but that also means it's got way too much stuff in it. Whereas Hindenburg Journalist Pro, which is the one that I use, is a podcast editor and a news report editor. So journalists use it. So they're not polishing stuff, they're just making it sound good, really quick at editing. It's really quick at, fades in and fades out and stuff, and it's really good. So if you are learning for the first time, my advice would be to learn a podcast editor, not to learn a music editor, because there's so much more that you needn't worry about in, Adobe or in Reaper or in any of those other services.
Great tips and great practical tips. Thank you. Now, I think I know the answer to this question, but how can people find out more about you and your work?
If you're serious about podcasting, then go and subscribe to Podnews. It's at podnews.net. You can be joining 13,700 people who are getting that email every single day. And you will also find me on the internet at james.cridland.net.
James, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Great, insightful commentary. Please stay safe.
Thanks so much for asking me.
Thank you for listening to the Practical Futurist podcast. You can find all of our previous shows at futurist.london. And if you like what you've heard on the show, please consider subscribing via your favourite podcast app so you never miss an episode. You can find out more about Andrew and how he helps corporates navigate a disruptive digital world with keynote speeches and C-suite workshops at futurist.london. Until next time, this has been the Practical Futurist podcast.